They put sharp metal things around my car only because I was growing tomatoes outside. But I found a secret legal trick the homeowners association person in charge didn't know about. What would you do if your neighbors tried to keep you like a prisoner for growing your own veggies? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The policeman looked at the metal spikes around my car, very confused. And they did this because of veggies? He asked, confused. Tomatoes, officer. It all began with tomatoes, I explained, showing him my outside area. Planters. I never imagined growing food would make me feel trapped at home. It all started 3 months earlier, when I got fired from my job as an accountant. I got the bad news on a Tuesday, with a final payment that wasn't enough to pay for my house the next month. That evening, I looked at the $200 bill from the grocery shop while having a small salad that cost $7, and I got a plan. The next day I went to a hardware shop and got some plastic pots, dirt, and baby vegetable plants. My parking area got plenty of sunshine every day, a space I could use to grow food and not spend so much. In a week, I had 2 lines of pots on both sides of my parking space, with tomatoes, peppers, and other plants. Then, the camera started taking photos. Jessica Miller from the opposite house was on her perfect grass, taking pictures of my garden. Her hair didn't even move as she took many photos. "Nice weather, right?" I shouted, waving. Jessica's smile was fake. "Just getting some photos for the community meeting," she said, walking away fast. That night I got an email from Bob Williams, the boss of the Maple Creek HOA. "Important notice for the house at 476 Oakwood Drive. Homes must look nice according to our rules. Your driveway setup breaks Rule 15.3. Please fix it in 7 days." I looked at our HOA book, checking all 43 pages twice. Nothing said I couldn't have pot gardens anywhere. Section 15.3 only talked about keeping driveways clear of things stored long-term. These weren't stored things. They were plants growing food. The following morning I saw a note on my mailbox. Gardens should be in the back, not where everyone can see them. It was from a worried neighbor. The writing was like Jessica's fancy writing from last year's holiday card. When I was taking out the rubbish later, Jessica and Bob were talking. Bob pointed at my house, shaking his head. Jessica was nodding. They both smiled when they saw me. 3 days later, a letter came, saying my farming actions didn't match our neighborhood style. The letter said I'd have to pay $100 every day starting next week. My stomach hurt when I thought about my small savings. That night, I looked up HOA laws until very late, learning about fair rules versus unfair ones. I printed the county's paper on what plants are, which said pot gardening was allowed in home areas. The next day I walked around, taking pictures of every broken rule I could see. Holiday decorations still up too late, unapproved lawn items, basketball hoops, all against HOA rules. But nobody cared. Only my gardens were a problem. I wrote a reply to Bob, mentioning the county rules and pointing out they were only picking on me. I was polite but firm. Before sending it, I talked to Mr. Rodriguez. "They're picking on you because Jessica wants to get the best-looking neighborhood prize next month," he said, giving me some coffee. "Her view from her window includes your driveway. She's been saying it looks bad to everyone, but it's just veggies." "I need to not spend a lot right now," I said. Mr. Rodriguez agreed. Bob always agrees with Jessica. Her husband plays golf with him every week. He leaned closer. "But they've made people angry. The Smiths left last year after getting fined because their daughter's wheelchair ramp was the wrong color. I sent my reply letter with copies of my research." 2 quiet days went by. Then, early Saturday morning, the bell rang. Bob was there with Jessica. "We got your reply," Bob said, not looking at me. "The group has decided to have a special meeting about your problem." "This isn't about you," Jessica added, but her mean smile said otherwise. "We just want our neighborhood to look good. House prices are important for everyone." I noticed Jessica's phone was recording us. I get caring about our neighborhood, I said calmly. That's why I'm growing good food instead of having an empty driveway. Nothing in our rules stops pot gardens. Bob's face got angry. The group explains the rules, not single house owners. The meeting is Tuesday at 7 p.m. As they left, I heard Jessica say, I told you they wouldn't listen. That afternoon, I found 5 neighbors with notes about small rule breaks, all people who had liked my garden. Someone was giving us a sign. I stayed up late again learning about my rights and found something surprising. Our county had a little-known grow your own food rule that protected growing food at home. Could this be my answer? As I looked at the county papers, I didn't know how far Jessica and Bob would go to win. Did you think they'd just accept a veggie garden here? My sister asked on the phone. I was sending her videos of my ruined pots, dirt, and young plants all over my driveway. You won't believe it, I said, my voice not steady. I went to get food for an hour and came back to this. The security camera I'd put up after finding the note on my mailbox had filmed everything. Jessica's son, Mark, and 2 other boys had ridden their bikes down my driveway, kicking over 2 big pots of tomatoes and peppers. You could hear Mark say, "Mom says these have to go." The boys laughed as dirt and broken plants fell everywhere. I showed him my pot garden and told him what happened. He sighed. HOA problems are not criminal matters, but ruining property is. He watched my video and wrote notes. Those kids definitely knocked over your pots on purpose, Officer Green said. Do you want to say they did a crime? I thought about it. Making things bigger might make it all worse. Not yet, I said, but I want this written down. After he left, I went to Jessica's house. She answered wearing gardening gloves, though her perfect grass showed no signs of any real gardening. Jessica's face got red, but she stayed looking cold. Those plants look bad and are bringing bugs here, she snapped. The HOA group has already talked about you. Ruining things isn't the answer, I replied. And there are no bugs. They're healthy plants and clean pots. This neighborhood had rules before you decided to make your driveway a farm, she said. Your little thing is making our house prices go down. As I left, she added, You should check your mail. The group voted yesterday. When I checked my mailbox, I found a letter saying I had 72 hours to take away all farming things from my driveway or pay $100 every day. It was signed by all 5 group members. The next morning, while watering my plants, I saw several neighbors looking upset. John from 3 houses down came over with a paper. Did you get one of these? He asked, showing me a violation note for his basketball hoop, which had been there for 4 years. They're picking on anyone who's been nice to me, I realized aloud. Bob's been fining people for years over silly things, John said, shaking his head. My mom couldn't paint her ramp the right color fast enough last year, and he fined her a lot. By noon, I'd counted 5 neighbors with these sudden notices, all for things that had been okay for months or years. A bird feeder, a small statue, wind chimes, a small box for sharing books. This is about your garden, said Susan from next door. Her notice was for flowers she'd planted 2 years ago. Jessica's been talking about cleaning up the neighborhood, starting with your farm problem. I invited everyone over that evening. 8 neighbors came, each with stories about Bob and Jessica only enforcing rules when they wanted to. They only care about rules when it helps them, said Michael, who had lived there for 20 years. Bob built a shed too big, but the group said it was okay. And Jessica's fish pond needed special permission, added Susan, which was given very fast. We agreed to go to the next HOA meeting together. Strength in numbers felt like our best plan. When everyone left, I looked up selective enforcement of HOA rules and wrote down every unfair thing in our neighborhood with photos and dates. I was making my argument. The next morning, a gardening truck came to my house. 2 men in uniforms came to my door. "The HOA sent us to take away plants that aren't allowed," the taller one said, giving me a paper signed by Bob. "You don't have permission to touch anything on my property," I replied firmly. "Please go." They looked unsure. "We were told the house owner had been told," the second man said. "I've gotten notices, but I'm saying they're unfair," I explained. "If you take anything without my permission, it's ruining private property." They left, but an hour later I got an email from Bob. "Your refusal to listen leaves us no choice but to do everything we can." That afternoon, while working, I saw Jessica showing 3 women around. When they got to my house, Jessica pointed at my driveway garden, and the women shook their heads. That evening, another letter came, this time saying they would take me to court if my farming actions weren't stopped in 48 hours. I called the county housing authority right away and talked to a man named Kevin. "HOAs have power, but they're not more important than the law," Kevin explained. "I suggest you check if your area has any farming history protections in its original plan." "Farming history?" I asked. "Many places here were built on old farms," Kevin explained. "Some have special rules protecting people's rights to grow food, usually in the first papers." I took photos of every page, my hands shaking. This could change everything. Returning home, I found my new pots had been covered with something that smelled bad. All the plants were dying. As I stood there, shocked, Jessica drove by, smiling and waving. I didn't know then that this was just the start of what she had planned. My mouth dropped when I saw what they were doing to my driveway. I was having breakfast when I heard a weird noise outside. I ran to the window and couldn't believe it. 2 men in yellow Maple Creek work clothes were putting metal strips with sharp spikes on both sides of my driveway. These weren't just blocks. They were real spike strips that would ruin my tires if I drove over them. "Hey, stop!" I yelled, running outside with my coffee. The workers didn't look up. The older one with gray hair said, "Just following HOA orders, miss. Nothing against you." "Orders for what? To trap me at home?" My voice was shaking as I started recording. The younger worker looked sorry. "It's called property marking for breaking rules. We're just working." I called the police right away, walking back and forth behind my now trapped car. Officer Martinez came 20 minutes later, but what he said made me sad. "I understand you're angry," he said, looking at his notes. "But this seems to be a problem between you and your HOA. They do have the power to mark rule breaking according to your neighborhood rules." "But they've trapped my car. I can't leave without ruining my tires." I pointed to the sharp metal shining in the sun. Officer Martinez looked unhappy. "That does seem too much. Have you tried talking to your HOA person?" I went straight to Bob's house, my hands shaking with anger. I never got to his door because Jessica came out of nowhere, stopping me. Her hair didn't move as she held up her phone, recording. Well, if it isn't Farmer Karen," she said, smiling meanly. "Those spike strips must be annoying." "This is against the law," I shouted, trying to stay calm but failing. "You can't trap someone on their property." Jessica's eyes got small. "You've been told many times about your veggie problem. The group voted last night." She waved some papers. "Those ugly pots break 3 HOA rules and lower our house prices. My sister sells houses, and she says houses on your street are getting lower offers. Farms belong in the countryside, not in Maple Creek," she snapped. "Take away those plants and we'll take away the blocks. Easy?" Bob came up behind her. "We've had complaints from 7 house owners. This isn't about you, it's about keeping things good." As they walked away, I heard Jessica laugh. Maybe she can grow enough to feed herself, since she won't be able to drive to the shop. That night, instead of crying, I got mad. And then I got clever. I drove my small lawnmower, avoiding the spikes, to my neighbor Lisa's house and borrowed her car. Then I went to the county records office, which was open late on Wednesdays. The worker looked uninterested as I asked for the first papers and rules for Maple Creek. "Problem with property?" she asked, not looking up. "You could say that," I replied. 3 hours later, with old papers and maps around me, I found it. The one thing the HOA had missed or hidden on purpose. My hands shook as I made copies, my mind thinking fast. This wasn't just a way out of my problem. This could change how our neighborhood was run. I drove home in Lisa's car. Lightning showed the spike strips around my driveway, but for the first time that day, I smiled. Bob and Jessica didn't know what was coming. "They put what around your driveway?" Carol Jones almost dropped her coffee when I showed her the photos of the spike strips. I'd called her first thing in the morning. She was the best property rights lawyer, and I'd found her number on a board at the records office. "Spike strips like the police use to stop cars," I explained, giving her the papers. "They're keeping me prisoner until I take away my veggie garden." Carol looked at the papers I'd found. After 10 minutes of reading quietly, she started laughing. A big laugh that made her helper look in to see what was happening. My heart was full of hope. "So, my garden is completely allowed?" "More than allowed. It's specially protected," Carol said, typing. "And those spike strips? That's keeping you there illegally, maybe even a crime. We're asking for a court order right now." By noon, the papers were sent to the court. Carol said I should write down everything, so I posted a photo of the spike strips on my neighborhood group online with a simple question. Is this how HOAs should solve problems about veggie gardens? The post got huge. By 3 p.m., a reporter from Channel 7 News came to my door, followed by 2 more news trucks. My phone kept buzzing with messages from neighbors I'd never met, sharing their own HOA bad stories. "We're live at Maple Creek, where a house owner says the HOA put dangerous spike strips around her car because she grew tomatoes in pots," the reporter said into the camera on my lawn. I was explaining when a black car stopped fast across the street. Jessica jumped out with Bob right behind her, both looking very angry. "Turn those cameras off!" Bob shouted, coming onto my lawn. "This is a private neighborhood problem." The reporter, seeing a chance for drama, told her cameraman to keep filming. "Mr. Williams, as HOA boss, did you allow these tire-ruining things to be put up?" "Those ugly things help feed my family," I said calmly, knowing my quiet reply would be different from their anger. "And nothing in the HOA rules stops container gardens." The cameras followed as Jessica and Bob went back, then walked up my path. Once the news team left, Jessica's perfectly painted fingernail pointed at my face. "You're making us look bad online," she hissed, her face red. "You put spike strips around my car," I reminded her evenly. "How would you describe that?" Bob stepped forward, making his voice sound calm. "Look, sir, we can fix this quietly. Take away your garden. We'll take away the strips and forget the rule breaks. No lawyers, no media." I took a breath and showed them the copy Carol had made. "I have a different offer," I replied, giving them the farming history papers. "Take away the strips right now, or I continue with my lawsuit, which now includes keeping me prisoner, bothering me, and breaking protected farming rights." Their faces changed as they read, first confused, then not believing, and finally realizing their huge mistake. But instead of giving up, Bob's face got hard. He took the papers and ripped them. "We'll see what our lawyers say about your little farm trick," he said. "The HOA has a lot of money for legal defense, and we're not scared to use it. Do you have that kind of money?" As they walked away, my phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "Judge Watkins is looking at our request now. Stay strong." I tried to focus on watering my plants that evening, but I was worried. What if the judge agreed with the HOA? What if Bob was right about their money lasting longer than my savings? At 2:17 a.m., my security camera's alarm woke me up. The lights showed a person by my garden. Jessica's husband, Tim, wearing a dark hoodie even though it was warm. Garden cutters were shining in his hands. On my phone screen I watched, not believing it, as he cut through every water line connecting my watering system, then cut the soil bags I'd stored for next season. I called the police right away, and this time they took it seriously. Officer Martinez arrived quickly, catching Tim still on my property. The look of shock on his face when the police car lights flashed was something I'll never forget. My husband was just checking for, rats around her garden, Jessica insisted, having rushed over in her fancy robe. Those veggie plants bring in pests. Officer Martinez picked up the garden cutters. With these, ma'am, we have the whole thing on video. As Tim was taken to the police car, I saw several neighbors watching from their windows. John from down the street gave me a thumbs up. Lisa waved. For the first time, I realized I wasn't fighting this alone. My phone buzzed with an email from Carol. Emergency hearing set for 9 a.m. tomorrow. We've got them. The courtroom was quiet as Judge Watkins came in, her serious face showing nothing. My stomach was in knots. I saw Bob and Jessica sitting confidently with their lawyer, a fancy man in a good suit who kept talking to Bob. They had 3 people on their side. I was surprised to see over 20 of my neighbors had come to support me, filling the seats behind Carol and me. Before we start, Judge Watkins said, fixing her glasses, I want to make something clear. I looked at the proof until midnight, and I am very upset by what I've seen. Bob's lawyer stood up smoothly. Your Honor, if I may. You may not, Judge Watkins cut him off. Mr. Parker, I've read your paper. Now I want to see these spike strips. The courtroom screens showed my photos and video. Several people gasped at the images of the metal teeth around my driveway. Mr. Williams, the judge addressed Bob directly, as HOA boss, did you allow these things to be put up? Bob stood, fixing his tie. Yes, Your Honor, but they were just property markers to show a rule break, not meant to— They are made to ruin tires, Judge Watkins interrupted. The company's bill specifically lists them as car-stopping spike systems. Did you or did you not want to stop Miss Walker from using her car? When Bob didn't answer, Jessica jumped up. She was breaking the rules. We gave her many warnings about that garden. The judge's hammer hit the desk sharply. Mrs. Davis, you are not allowed to speak. Please sit down. Carol showed the farming history papers next, explaining how they were older and more important than any HOA rules. Bob's lawyer said that modern neighborhood rules should be more important, but his voice wasn't strong when Judge Watkins held up the first agreement. This writing is very clear, she said. The right to grow food on one's land is clearly protected. Also, there's nothing in the current HOA rules that specifically stops pot gardening. Then came the security video from last night. Tim Davis cutting my water lines at 2:17 a.m. Jessica's face turned red as her husband's actions played on the screens. Mr. Davis has already been charged with a crime, Officer Martinez testified. He admitted Mrs. Davis asked him to do something about the garden situation. After just 40 minutes of talking, Judge Watkins gave her decision. The court decides for the person suing, she announced. The Maple Creek HOA's actions are illegal keeping of someone, bothering, and breaking protected property rights. Her voice got harder. Putting physical blocks stopping a house owner from using their car is very bad. This court doesn't like people taking the law into their own hands. Bob's face went from red to white. Jessica put her face in her hands. Your Honor, Bob's lawyer began, we plan to fight this. That is your right, Judge Watkins nodded. But the removal order and choice requirement will not be stopped during any fighting. And Mr. Williams, Mrs. Davis, if there is any more bothering of Miss Walker, this court will not wait to find you breaking the rules. Are we clear? They nodded quietly, As we left the courtroom, Carol squeezed my arm. "This is a bigger win than you might know. This case makes a rule for thousands of house owners in similar situations." When I turned onto my street that afternoon, I couldn't believe my eyes. A crowd had gathered outside my house, and at first I was scared. Had Jessica organized some kind of protest? But as I got closer, I realized they were my neighbors, cheering and clapping. The work crew was already taking away the spike strips under Officer Martinez's eye. Tears filled my eyes again as Lisa and her husband showed a handmade sign they'd made. Maple Creek Community Gardens, growing together. They'd gotten signatures from over 50 neighbors who wanted to start a shared garden area in the unused land behind the neighborhood playground. "We never knew about that farming history rule," Lisa explained. "It's for the whole area, not just your property. We've been wanting community garden space for years." Even more surprising were the visitors from other neighborhoods. "We heard about what happened here," a woman from Oak Ridge Estates told me as she looked at my growing tomato plants. "Our HOA has been just as bad. Can you tell us how you found that first agreement?" I made my own garden bigger, adding a small sign, "Community Harvest, take what you need." The children from the neighborhood started coming by after school, curious about how food grows. Mrs. Gonzalez, who had first signed Jessica's complaint, shyly asked for gardening advice when her grandchild became interested in my strawberry plants. "I was wrong," she admitted, watching her grandchild carefully water the small plants I'd given them. "Jessica kept saying these plants would make our house prices go down, but my daughter's family is now thinking of moving here because of the community garden. Jessica still lives across the street, but now crosses to the other side when she sees me." Tim finished his community service hours by, funnily enough, helping build garden beds for the new community garden. He was quite good at building things when not sneaking around cutting water lines. The biggest surprise came 3 months later. I was asked to speak at the county planning meeting about city farming rights. 3 nearby HOA communities wanted help starting their own community garden spaces, inspired by our story. "Your case has become famous," the person in charge told me. "People are wanting to know what rights they actually have under these strict HOAs." This morning, as I picked the last tomatoes of the season from my driveway plant, I noticed light marks still on the concrete where the spike strips had been. I couldn't help but smile. They're a reminder that standing up for what's right can change more than just your own situation. I looked at my growing garden, then at the community garden beyond, where neighbors worked together among rows of veggies and flowers. Sometimes the best harvests aren't the ones you can eat, but the friendships and changes that grow from standing your ground.